Genevieve Ashcroft was about to fire Mason Hale when his wallet slipped from his jacket and hit the boardroom floor. It fell open, and there was no cash inside, no cards facing up, only a small photograph gone soft at the corners. A picture of a girl no older than 8, standing in front of a lake house that had been erased from every family conversation she had ever known. That alone would have been strange enough for a woman who trusted almost no one. But it was the handwriting on the back that stopped her breath in her chest, because it belonged to her mother, dead 11 years, and it read like a promise someone had been keeping in silence. Mason Hale had said nothing for 28 years. That night, for the first time, he would have to explain why. Before the truth breaks loose, stay close, because what this photograph reveals is not just a story of one company or one family. Press subscribe now so you never miss the moments when the powerful are finally forced to answer for the people they left behind. The emergency board meeting had been called for 7 in the morning. An hour Conrad Ashcroft favored because it left people too groggy to argue properly. Genevieve arrived already dressed for war, her hair pulled back, her tablet loaded with the quarterly figures for the Blue Haven hydroelectric project, the crown achievement of Ashcroft Meridian infrastructure and the single largest contract the company had signed in a decade. Rain streaked the tall windows behind the head of the table, the kind of steady autumn downpour that turned the city skyline into a smear of gray light, and Genevieve found herself glancing at it twice before the meeting even started, unable to say why the sound of water against glass made the hair on her arms rise. The boardroom smelled of fresh coffee nobody had touched, and the particular tension that settles into a room when everyone present already suspects the meeting will not end well. Genevieve took her seat at the head of the table, aware, as she always was in that room, of the oil portrait of her grandfather watching from the far wall, his painted eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, as if he still expected the company to answer to him rather than to her. Mason sat near the far end of the long table, a folder of printed data in front of him, his jacket a size too formal for a man who spent most of his working hours in steel-toed boots on concrete platforms. He was the independent safety engineer the audit committee had brought in 6 weeks earlier, hired specifically because he had no history with the Ashcroft family and no reason to protect anyone's reputation but his own. He began without ceremony. The pressure sensors along the spillway gates at Blue Haven were returning readings that made no engineering sense, numbers that contradicted each other by margins too wide to be explained by faulty calibration alone. Someone had altered portions of the official inspection report before it reached the state regulator, smoothing spikes that should have triggered an automatic halt. Mason recommended delaying the launch date by no fewer than 60 days, so an outside team could run a full diagnostic on every valve and every gate along the dam face. He said it the way engineers say difficult things, flatly, without decoration, because he had learned long ago that decoration only gave powerful men an excuse to dismiss the message. Conrad Ashcroft, chairman of the board and the only man at the table who still called Genevieve by her childhood nickname in front of strangers, laughed before Mason had even finished his sentence. He suggested, not quite joking, that a contract engineer had every financial incentive to manufacture a crisis, since delays meant extended billing, and extended billing meant a fatter invoice for a man who was, after all, not even a permanent employee of the company. 2 board members chuckled along with him. Genevieve did not. She had read Mason's data twice before the meeting and found nothing in it that resembled fabrication, only the kind of quiet, stubborn caution that made her uneasy in a different way, because caution like that usually meant somebody somewhere was hiding something worse than a bad sensor. She stood at the crossroads every chief executive eventually reaches and dreads. Delaying the launch could cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars and send the stock price into a spiral that analysts would spend a full year picking apart. Ignoring the warning could put an entire town downstream of that dam at the mercy of a gate system nobody could fully vouch for. She was still weighing the two futures in her mind when Mason rose to gather his papers, and Conrad, moving with the practiced carelessness of a man who had never once been questioned in that room, brushed against his shoulder hard enough to send the old leather wallet tumbling from his jacket. It hit the polished floor and sprang open, the soft slap of old leather against marble, louder than it had any right to be in a room that had otherwise gone quiet with the awkwardness of watching a grown man scramble for his own belongings. Genevieve bent down out of habit more than courtesy, the same reflex that made her pick up a dropped pen for an intern, and her hand froze an inch above the photograph. For a moment, the rest of the room fell away entirely. The murmured conversations, the rustle of Conrad's papers, the low hum of the ventilation system, all of it dimming beneath the sudden absurd thunder of her own pulse. A little girl in a blue coat, standing in front of a lake house with cedar shingles and a crooked dock, squinting into a sun that had not shone on that particular property, according to any official record, in nearly 3 decades. She recognized the coat before she recognized her own face. She recognized the dock before she remembered ever standing on it. Mason reached for the wallet a half-second too late. Genevieve straightened, and something in her posture made the room go still, the particular stillness that settles over a company when the person with the most power stops performing patience. She asked the staff to leave, all of them, including Conrad, who protested for exactly 1 sentence before catching the look on her face and deciding the argument was not worth losing in front of witnesses. When the door closed, she set the photograph on the table between them like evidence at a trial and asked 3 questions in a row, evenly spaced, giving him no room to answer only the easiest one. Where did you get this? Why do you carry it? How long have you been watching me? Mason did not answer any of them directly. He said only that the photograph had been placed in his hands before Genevieve was old enough to read her own name, and that he had never once approached her, contacted her, or sought out her company in the 28 years since, though he had known, from the moment he saw her name on the audit contract, exactly whose family he would be walking back into. Genevieve turned the photograph over with 2 fingers, the way a person handles something they suspect might burn them, and read the handwriting on the back for the first time. She knew the slant of those letters the way she knew the sound of her own name spoken in anger. It was her mother's hand, and it said something about a truth that needed to wait until a daughter was strong enough to choose it for herself. She looked up at Mason Hale with a question in her eyes that she did not yet have the words to ask out loud. By 9 that same morning, Genevieve had ordered a full background review of Mason's employment file, his financial records, and every database the company's internal security team was legally permitted to search. The results came back frustratingly clean. No criminal history, no restraining orders, no pattern of contact with the Ashcroft family before the audit committee brought him on, no digital trail suggesting he had ever so much as searched her name online. His record read like the file of a man who had spent 3 decades trying very hard to be forgettable, which, to a woman raised inside a family obsessed with legacy, felt like its own kind of strange. There was, however, one gap that caught her attention immediately. The Hale family had lived at Blue Haven decades earlier, back when the lake had been a private resort owned outright by her grandfather, and they had left the town abruptly, within days of the incident that the family still referred to, when it was mentioned at all, as the night Genevieve wandered off and was found safe the following morning by the search team. She had grown up believing that story the way children believe the furniture in a house has always been arranged exactly as it stands. She read the personnel file twice more that morning, searching for something, anything, that would let her file Mason Hale away into a category she already understood: a grifter, a stalker, an opportunist chasing a payday. She found instead a man who paid his property taxes early, coached a youth soccer team for 6 seasons after his wife died, and had never once, in nearly 3 decades, filed so much as a parking dispute against a government agency. It unsettled her more than any red flag could have. People who wanted something from the Ashcroft name usually announced themselves loudly. Mason had done the opposite for 28 years, and Genevieve did not yet have a framework for what that kind of patience meant. She confronted Mason directly, asking whether he was the one who had taken the photograph. He told her the photographer had been her mother, Lydia Ashcroft, and nothing more. He refused to elaborate while Conrad and the company's legal counsel still had access to the internal investigation, a caution that struck Genevieve, in the moment, as evasive rather than protective. She read it as a man leveraging a family secret to shield himself from a very legitimate safety inquiry, and the suspicion cooled whatever sympathy had been building in her chest. She suspended his contract that afternoon and demanded every file, every dataset, every note related to the Blue Haven audit be surrendered to internal counsel by the end of the business day. Conrad appeared in her office within the hour, composed in the way that only men who have never feared consequences can be composed, until his eyes landed on the back of the photograph still sitting on her desk. Something shifted behind his expression, fast, almost imperceptible, gone before she could name it. He recovered quickly and urged her to call the police, calling Mason a man dangerously fixated on a childhood connection that had clearly curdled into obsession over the years. Genevieve watched her uncle's face while he spoke and noticed, for the first time in her adult life, that she was watching it the way she watched hostile negotiators across a table, cataloging every tell instead of simply trusting the words. Before Mason left the building that day, he stopped in the lobby long enough to warn her that the failures showing up at Blue Haven were not the result of ordinary wear or an ordinary accident. Someone, he said, was repeating almost exactly what had happened 28 years earlier, and he suspected she did not yet know what that meant. Genevieve told him to leave the premises. It was only after he had gone that she noticed Conrad, standing near the elevators, quietly instructing the head of security to duplicate the hard drive from Mason's company laptop and erase every file connected to the Blue Haven inspection before end of day. That night, walking past her uncle's open office door on her way to the parking garage, she heard him on the phone, his voice pitched low but not quite low enough. "The Hale family," he said, "should have disappeared a long time ago." Genevieve did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with the photograph propped against a glass of water she never touched, and she began pulling up newspaper archives from the year she turned 8, scanning coverage of the night she had always been told was nothing more than a frightened little girl wandering too far from the main house. The articles were thin, vague, written in the polished language of a family that controlled the local paper's largest advertising account. They said she had been discovered near the main lodge at dawn, cold but unharmed, delivered safely into the arms of the search party. The hospital admission record, which she found buried in an old insurance file her mother had kept, told a different story. It listed her point of transport not as the main lodge, but as an old ranger's cabin more than 3 miles into the tree line. The name of the person who had carried her out had been redacted, a black line drawn through it decades before she had ever thought to ask who it belonged to. Fragments began surfacing that she had never let herself examine too closely. The kind of half-memories a person files away as dreams because the alternative is too disorienting. A coat, far too large for her small shoulders, draped over her by someone else's hands. A boy holding a flashlight steady despite the wind trying to rip it from his grip. A voice telling her to count the seconds between the thunder and the lightning to give her frightened mind something small and countable to hold on to. A promise, spoken with the flat certainty only children and honest men seem able to manage, that she would not be left alone. Miles away, Mason returned to the small house he had shared with his late wife, and now shared only with the quiet that had settled in after Avery left for college. His daughter called that evening, her voice bright with the ordinary chaos of dormitory life, and it took her less than a minute of hearing her father's tone to understand that something had gone wrong. Through the conversation, without either of them stating it outright, the shape of Mason's life became clear. A man who had raised a daughter alone since losing his wife 6 years earlier, who worked with his hands and kept his promises the way other men kept mortgages, as an obligation that never truly left the ledger. Avery had grown up watching her father protect a stranger's photograph with more care than he gave his own wallet, and she had never once received a full explanation for why. She told him, gently but without softening the point, that keeping a promise did not mean he was required to carry the whole weight of it alone for the rest of his life. Mason listened to his daughter's voice, so much like her mother's it sometimes caught him off guard in the middle of an ordinary sentence, and thought about all the years he had let that photograph sit quietly in the dark of his wallet instead of answering the questions it clearly deserved. He told Avery he loved her, that he would call again once he understood what tomorrow was going to look like, and sat for a long while afterward at the kitchen table, where he had once taught her to do long division, listening to the refrigerator hum and the house settle around him the way it did every night now that it belonged to only one person. The phone rang again before Mason had finished his coffee. Samuel Kincaid, retired county safety inspector and one of the only men left alive who remembered the old Blue Haven files in full, told him that someone had broken into the storage unit where his archived reports were kept, searching specifically for anything with the Blue Haven name attached. Mason understood immediately what that meant. Conrad had stopped reacting and started moving. At nearly the same hour, Genevieve discovered that Mason's father, once the head of technical operations at the Ashcroft Family Resort, had been terminated within hours of her disappearance being reported, dismissed before any investigation into the cause of the flooding had even begun. The termination letter carried Conrad Ashcroft's signature, dated the very night she was found. Genevieve arranged to meet Mason the following evening at her mother's old greenhouse, a glass structure at the edge of the family estate that had never been wired for the company's internal security cameras, a fact she had only ever used before to avoid her relatives, never to protect a conversation from them. The greenhouse had gone half wild since Lydia's death, ferns crowding the walkways, the glass panes fogged with condensation, and Genevieve found herself grateful for the neglect because it meant no one from the household staff bothered to check on it anymore. She placed the photograph on a wooden potting table between them and told him plainly that she wanted the entire truth, not the careful half version he had been rationing out in a boardroom full of lawyers. Mason told her about the night 28 years earlier without embellishment, the way he told everything, because he had learned that ornamented stories tended to collapse under questioning while plain ones held their shape. His father had discovered that Conrad ordered an old spillway gate opened against every weather warning on record, hoping to flood a stretch of land belonging to a farmer who had refused, for the third consecutive year, to sell his acreage to the Ashcroft family. When Genevieve went missing in the chaos that followed, the adults on the property spent the first frantic hour protecting the resort liability rather than searching the tree line, and it was Mason, 12 years old, and furious in a way only children can be when the adults around them are behaving like cowards, who followed her small footprints into the dark on his own. He found her curled beneath the roots of a fallen cedar, soaked through and shaking so hard her teeth had stopped chattering and simply locked. He carried her to the abandoned ranger's cabin because it was closer than the main lodge, and because he did not trust the water levels near the dock. He built a fire in a stove that had not been lit in years, gave her his coat, gave her half a stale biscuit from his jacket pocket, and sat with his back against the door until the rain stopped and the water receded enough to walk her out safely at first light. Lydia Ashcroft arrived before anyone else, and for one unguarded moment she thanked Mason with the kind of gratitude that comes before a family has decided how a story will officially be told. Then Conrad appeared, and within an hour the entire narrative had been rewritten. The Hale family was blamed for negligent equipment maintenance, a charge Mason's father refused to sign his name to, which only escalated the threats until the family was told to leave the county within the week or face fabricated criminal charges designed to bury them in legal costs they could never afford to fight. Mason explained that he had considered finding Genevieve many times over the years that followed, but she had still been a child living entirely inside Conrad's sphere of influence, and he understood, even at that age, that if he appeared without proof, Conrad would simply reframe him as a manipulator chasing money, and Genevieve would grow up believing the Hale family had truly been the ones who failed her. Genevieve asked the question that mattered more than any other. "Why did you keep carrying it?" Mason answered that the photograph reminded him he was never allowed to turn an innocent child into a weapon against her own family, no matter how much that family deserved to be exposed. Genevieve felt something crack open in her chest, gratitude tangled with a fresh, sharper anger, because he had also, without asking her, decided on her behalf when she would be considered strong enough to receive the truth. Mason did not defend the decision. He admitted, plainly, that it had been a mistake to let so many years pass in silence. Then he told her something that made the anger in the room shift direction entirely. The current Blue Haven project was using nearly the same spillway configuration that had failed 28 years earlier, and the new inspection reports were being altered in the exact same pattern, smoothing over pressure readings that should have forced an immediate shutdown. The next morning, Conrad called an emergency board session to formally approve Blue Haven's launch and to strip Genevieve of her operational authority over the project entirely. Genevieve was not fully convinced of Mason's account, not yet, but she had stopped believing anything Conrad told her either, which was, in its own way, a kind of progress. She quietly hired an outside technical audit firm with no ties to the company and ordered a full backup of every Blue Haven data file before the internal system could be wiped clean, routing the request through a junior systems administrator who owed his job to Genevieve rather than to the board. She and Mason returned together to the lake for the first time in 28 years, standing before the ranger's cabin that had somehow survived 3 decades of neglect, its timber walls silvered by weather, a single shuttered window hanging crooked on one hinge. The air smelled of wet pine and cold mineral water, a scent that hit something buried so deep in Genevieve's memory that her knees actually softened for a moment before she caught herself against the doorframe. Mason noticed but said nothing, only waited, the way he seemed to wait for everything, patient in a manner she was beginning to recognize as its own quiet form of respect. Memory returned to her in pieces sharper than anything she had recovered on her own. She remembered half a biscuit passed between small cold hands, the crumbs catching in her throat because she had been shaking too hard to chew properly. She remembered a coat too heavy for her shoulders, smelling of wood smoke and rain, and a boy who never once let his voice shake, even when his hands clearly had, counting the seconds between thunderclaps with her, until the storm finally lost interest and moved on toward the next county. Standing in the doorway of that cabin as a grown woman, she finally understood why the sound of rain against glass had unsettled her that morning in the boardroom. Some part of her had been listening for that storm every single year since, waiting to see if it would come back for her. Mason did not try to collect gratitude from the memory. He moved through the site methodically, checking valve housings and cable joints, and found clear evidence that several sensors had been deliberately recalibrated to hide pressure spikes that should have triggered automatic alarms months earlier. They found Samuel Kincaid waiting at a diner near the county line, and he told them his old field notebook, the one Mason's father had given him for safekeeping decades ago, still existed, still contained a handwritten log proving Conrad had personally ordered the spillway opened that night against every recorded warning. Samuel admitted he had never released the notebook because he had been threatened with the loss of his pension, and worse, threatened in ways that touched his custody of his own children at the time. He was, he said now, finally ready to testify. Something quieter had begun growing between Genevieve and Mason during those long hours at the lake. Not romance exactly, not yet, but the particular closeness that forms between two people who have decided to stop performing for each other. Genevieve noticed that Mason had never once tried to remind her that he was the boy who saved her life. Mason noticed that the woman standing beside him was not cold by nature, only carefully trained since childhood to trust no one who approached her without suspicion first. They returned to the office that evening to find the newly backed up Blue Haven data had already been deleted from the primary server, and worse, the security logs showed Mason's access badge had been used to enter the server room at the exact hour of the deletion, though Mason had been standing beside a lake 3 counties away. Conrad struck first, feeding a version of the story to a friendly business journalist before Genevieve had time to prepare a response. In the version that ran, Mason became a man who had secretly carried a photograph of the company's chief executive since her childhood and had now infiltrated the corporate system under the guise of an independent audit. Reporters descended on Mason's small consulting firm within hours. Clients canceled contracts overnight, their apologetic emails arriving in a steady, humiliating stream, each one careful to avoid saying outright what everyone clearly believed. Avery was cornered outside her dormitory building by a photographer asking whether her father had ever discussed his fixation with the family that once employed him, a question so far from the truth that she froze on the front steps for a full minute before finding her voice enough to tell the man to leave. She called her father in tears that night, not from fear but from fury, and Mason listened to his daughter defend him with more conviction than he had ever managed to defend himself. Mason chose to withdraw from the investigation to protect his daughter, returning the photograph to Genevieve and telling her the promise he made to Lydia had, as far as he was concerned, been fulfilled. Genevieve was publicly forced to announce Mason's suspension, a move he initially read as final proof that she had chosen her family's name over the truth. In reality, the suspension was a piece of theater designed to convince Conrad his cover story had worked. Genevieve quietly ordered a full forensic review of the badge access logs and discovered the entry credential used that night had actually come from a cloned card manufactured by a device belonging to the Internal Security Division, a division that answered directly to Conrad. Digging further through the family's private archive, she located the original termination letter for Mason's father, dated and drafted before Genevieve had even been found safe, proof that Conrad had planned to make the Hale family the scapegoat before anyone knew whether she would survive the night at all. Beside it, in a folder she had never opened, she found an unsent letter from her mother, admitting that Lydia had stayed silent for years to protect her daughter, but had always hoped that daughter would one day find the courage to do what she herself never could. Genevieve went to Mason's house that same night. She did not ask for forgiveness. She told him only that the board would vote the following morning to remove her from her own company, and that she needed him to tell the truth one final time, not to save her career, but to save the people living downstream of a dam that was not as safe as the paperwork claimed. The board convened at 8 the following morning. Conrad opened with 3 demands laid out like a formal indictment: the permanent termination of Mason's consulting contract, the removal of Genevieve as chief executive for concealing a personal relationship with an outside contractor, and immediate authorization to launch Blue Haven on the original schedule. He displayed an enlarged photograph of the picture found in Mason's wallet, presenting it as proof of manipulation and hidden motive. Genevieve did not deny that Mason carried the photograph. Instead, she asked her uncle, calmly, in front of the full board, how he had recognized the image so instantly before she herself had said a single word about it. The temperature of the room changed. Conrad's mouth opened and closed once. The practiced ease that had carried him through 40 years of boardrooms suddenly nowhere to be found. And for the first time in her life, Genevieve watched her uncle look like a man, calculating how much time he had left before the walls of a very familiar room turned against him. She laid out the evidence in sequence, giving the board no time to recover between each revelation, her voice steady in the particular way she had trained herself to sound since she was 22 years old, and had first learned that any tremor in a woman's voice would be read as weakness in that building, no matter how solid the facts behind it. The security logs proving Mason's badge had been cloned, the original, unaltered sensor data from Blue Haven, the termination letter for Mason's father, drafted before her rescue was even confirmed, her mother's unsent letter. Samuel Kincaid's corroborated field notebook, financial records showing Conrad stood to collect a substantial personal bonus if the dam launched precisely on schedule. Mason was brought into the room as an independent technical witness. Conrad pressed him one last time, demanding to know why an ordinary engineer would carry a photograph of the chief executive in his wallet for nearly 3 decades. This time, Mason answered in full. He said Lydia Ashcroft had handed him the photograph and asked him to return the truth to her daughter once that daughter was strong enough to choose what to do with it. But that, he said, was not the only reason. He kept it to remind himself that Genevieve Ashcroft was never simply the symbol of a powerful family name. She had once been a frightened, freezing, entirely innocent child who trusted him completely in the dark, and he refused to let bitterness toward her relatives turn her into a weapon he used against them. He kept the photograph, he said, not because he was waiting for her, but because he had promised never to turn her into a debt someone else could collect. His voice did not rise as he said it, but something in the room had gone very quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a true thing spoken plainly among people who spend most of their lives speaking carefully instead. Genevieve did not look away from him while he spoke, and for the first time since the meeting began, she felt the anger she had carried toward her own family settle into something closer to grief sharp and clean, the kind that finally has a name attached to it. Conrad dismissed the sentiment as legally meaningless. At that exact moment, representatives from the state regulatory agency arrived at the boardroom door. Genevieve had transmitted the technical data to them before the meeting even began. Blue Haven was placed under emergency suspension on the spot. Facing the real prospect of criminal liability and catastrophic financial exposure, the remaining board members turned on Conrad within minutes, using the very governance clause he had planned to use against Genevieve to strip him, instead of every title and privilege he held. Genevieve now faced the harder decision. Her legal counsel urged her to handle the matter quietly, settling behind closed doors to protect the stock price and avoid a scandal that could cost the company billions. She chose instead to make it public. She admitted in a company-wide statement and later before the press that Ashcroft Meridian had concealed known safety failures at Blue Haven decades earlier and had allowed an innocent family to absorb the blame. She apologized directly to the Hale family and to every landowner harmed by the original flooding, restored Mason's father's name to the company's official record, and established an independent oversight board with full authority over future safety decisions, stripping her own family of unilateral control. The stock dropped sharply in the days that followed, and analysts spent a difficult week debating whether the company would survive the fallout intact. But the transparency ultimately spared Ashcroft Meridian from a far worse collapse, and many employees rallied publicly behind Genevieve. Recognizing that for the first time in the company's long history, someone bearing the Ashcroft name had chosen safety over reputation without hesitation. Letters arrived at her office from residents of the town downstream of Blue Haven, some angry, some grateful, all of them proof that the decision, however costly, had reached the people it was meant to protect. Mason was fully cleared of any wrongdoing. He declined the executive safety position Genevieve offered him afterward, telling her honestly that he did not want to become a symbol of her redemption story, and that he did not want whatever gratitude remained between them to be mistaken for something it was not yet ready to become. Genevieve respected the boundary. She tried to return the photograph to him, but he refused it, saying the promise attached to it had finally been kept and that the picture now belonged to her and to her mother's memory rather than to him. Genevieve answered that her mother had entrusted it, all those years ago, to the only person patient enough never to use it against her. They parted that evening without a single promise made between them, only a quiet understanding that the story was not entirely finished. 6 months passed before Ashcroft Meridian found its footing again. Blue Haven was redesigned from the ground up with a modernized safety system built under the new Independent Oversight Board, and while Genevieve remained chief executive, the unchecked authority her family had wielded for generations was permanently curtailed. Mason started a small independent safety consulting firm of his own, taking on Ashcroft Meridian contracts only through open, competitive bidding, refusing any arrangement that made him dependent on Genevieve personally. She visited his workshop one afternoon without an assistant trailing behind her and without the company car waiting at the curb. She brought the original photograph with her, now professionally restored and sealed in an archival case, no longer folded inside anyone's wallet. She asked him, plainly, whether whatever existed between them had grown only from the night he saved her life, or from something that belonged to who they actually were now. Mason admitted he had feared exactly that question for weeks. But the frightened child in that photograph and the woman standing in front of him, he told her, were two entirely different people, and it was the second one he found himself thinking about at the end of every ordinary day. Genevieve told him she did not need saving again. What she wanted was someone willing to tell her the truth, even on the days she did not particularly want to hear it. Mason agreed to have dinner with her that week, not as an engineer meeting a chief executive, not as a rescuer meeting the person he once rescued, only as Mason and Genevieve, two adults finally standing on equal ground. Avery came home for the weekend not long after and noticed the change in her father immediately, though she was wise enough not to tease him about it. She only remarked that it had been a very long time since she had seen him get ready for an evening that had nothing to do with work. That same week, Mason opened a kitchen drawer, set the old worn wallet inside it, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, bought himself a new one. A year later, Blue Haven reopened to the public with a completely rebuilt safety infrastructure and a small memorial plaque near the visitor entrance honoring the people who had once tried to warn the county about the dam and paid a steep price for it, including Mason's father and Lydia Ashcroft by name. Genevieve did not place her own name anywhere on that plaque. After the ceremony, she and Mason walked together to the old ranger's cabin, which the Historical Society had voted to preserve as part of the county's official record, rather than allow it to be quietly demolished. She handed him a second photograph, this one new, showing the two of them standing at the edge of the lake in ordinary clothes, no boardroom in sight, no cameras beyond the one Avery had held that afternoon a few weeks earlier, when the three of them shared lunch together for the first time. Mason asked why she wanted him to keep it. Genevieve told him the first photograph had represented a promise he was obligated to keep whether he wanted to or not. This second one represented something he was finally free to choose for himself. Mason turned the new photograph over in his fingers the way he once turned over the old one, studying it, though this time there was no defensiveness in the gesture, no old instinct to hide it away before anyone could ask questions. The lake behind them caught the late afternoon light and turned the color of hammered copper, and somewhere beyond the tree line a loon called once and went silent. The same sound, Genevieve realized, that must have echoed through those woods on the night everything began. She thought of her mother then, not with the ache that used to accompany the memory, but with something quieter, closer to gratitude, for a woman who had understood, long before her daughter did, that some truths could not be forced, only entrusted to someone patient enough to wait for the right moment to let them go. Mason slipped the new photograph into his new wallet. The original photograph of an 8-year-old girl in a blue coat remained safely with Genevieve, filed alongside her mother's unsent letter, and the restored record clearing the Hale family name, in a small archive at the family estate that no one else was permitted to alter again. 28 years earlier, Mason had carried a photograph because of a promise made to a woman who was no longer alive to see it kept. This time he carried one simply because of the woman still standing beside him.